I've kept a ledger every day of my life since I was 11 years old. Names on the left. What's owed on the right? My father taught me that a man who doesn't know what he owes doesn't know what he is, and for 51 years I believed him. I wrote down eggs. I wrote down fence wire. I wrote down the $2 Curtis Vance borrowed in 1919 and never paid back, and I wrote down the 4 times I lied to my wife before she died, though I never showed anybody that page. Then in the spring of 1934, a woman got off a cattle truck in the Rio Perdido Valley, carrying one cardboard suitcase held shut with a belt. She had no land, no husband, no money to speak of. She had a recipe card in her grandmother's hand, so worn at the folds the letters had gone soft. And within 2 years, half this valley owed her their lives. I never could get that entered properly. I tried. I've got a whole page of it, and it's just her name, over and over, and nothing in the right-hand column at all, because there is no number you can put next to what she did, and there was never any way on God's earth to pay it back. This is the story I've been afraid to write down. I'm going to tell it wrong. I want you to know that going in. I was there and I still don't understand the woman, and I'm not sure I understood myself either in those days. But she's gone now, and I'm the last one left who saw her the night the fire took her roof. So somebody had better say it out loud. The fire had already eaten the porch by the time I got there, and she was running toward it. I want to be clear about the order of things because I've had 30 years to arrange them in my head and I keep getting it backwards. First, there was the light on the ridge, the wrong color for morning. Then the smell, not wood smoke, something meaner, kerosene laid down in a line. Then me on the road with my boots unlaced, an old man's run, more falling forward than anything. And then Marta Cazador coming out of the smoke, going the wrong direction. I hollered at her. I remember that. I remember my voice cracking like a boy's, and I remember it not mattering at all, because she went through her own doorway into a room that was already orange. 9 seconds. I counted because I count things, that's my sickness. That's what my daughter calls it, and she's not wrong. 9 seconds and the roof beam over the kitchen came down with a sound like a shot, and I thought, well, that's it. That's a woman dead in a shack she didn't even own, and I stood in the dirt with my hands hanging. At 11 seconds she came back out. Not with a strongbox. Not with money, and there was money, I found out later, $11 in a coffee can under the floor, and it burned, every bill of it. She came out with a suitcase and a card. The suitcase was already scorched black on one side, the pasteboard bubbling up. The card she had folded into her fist. She was on her knees in the yard with her lungs going like a bellows, and she didn't look at the house. That's what got me. Her whole life was standing there roaring, and she never once turned her head to watch it. She opened her fist, checked the card. Read it, I think, read it in that light with her eyebrows singed off. Then she pressed it against her chest, flat, the way you'd press something to stop it bleeding. I got down beside her, 51 years old, and my knees popped like green wood. I said something useless. I said, ma'am, is there anybody else in there? And she shook her head once and coughed, and blood came, and she wiped it on the back of her wrist and looked at the smear like it was a nuisance and nothing more. Then she said the first words I ever heard from her. She said, "The stove is still standing." I turned around. The house was gone, but the iron stove was standing in the middle of it like a headstone, 4 legs in the ashes, and she was looking at it the way I've seen men look at a horse that came back. I should tell you about the valley, or none of this lands right. Rio Perdido, 300 and some souls if you counted the ones out at the sheep camps, and by 34 you didn't count them anymore because they'd gone. 4 years of drought. The river were named after had gone underground the way a whipped dog goes under a porch, and what was left was a track of white stones and a smell of hot mineral. My grass was gone. My father's grass, that he'd broke his back and his brother's back for, was gone. I'd sold 60 head in October at $4 a head because they weren't worth the hauling. I sat in the truck afterward and did not cry, and I've never been sure whether that was strength or just a thing that had broken in me and quit sending the signal. There was hunger in that valley, not the picturesque kind. The kind where Alma Freed's boy stopped growing, just stopped, stayed the height he'd been at 9, and had that old man's face on him at 12. The kind where you started noticing which dogs were still around and which weren't and you didn't ask. And into that came a woman off a cattle truck with a suitcase and no invitation. The truck let her off at the crossroads because the driver was hauling south and she wasn't going south. I saw her from the wagon road, a half-mile off, standing at the crossroads a long time. I remember thinking she was waiting for somebody. I found out later she wasn't. She was deciding. Her name was Marta Cazador, and she was Chiricahua, born at Fort Sill in the Oklahoma Territory in 1898, which means she was born a prisoner of war. I want that plain, not a figure of speech. Her mother was a prisoner and her grandmother was a prisoner, and Marta came into the world already inside that fence, and she was 9 years old before anyone told her that this was unusual. I didn't know any of that for 2 years. She never volunteered a thing about herself. The valley made up its own stories in the meantime, and they were all wrong, and most of them were ugly. When they finally cut the Fort Sill people loose, some went to Mescalero and some stayed in Oklahoma and farmed, and Marta's family did the second thing. And then the dust came and took Oklahoma the way the drought took us, and she buried a husband and a daughter in the same season. The daughter first, which is the wrong order, and I have some experience of that wrong order myself. And when there was nothing left, she got on a cattle truck going west because her grandmother had come from a valley with a lost river in it, and told her once, when she was small, that the acorns there were sweeter than anywhere. That's it, that's the whole reason she came here. An old woman's remark about acorns, remembered 40 years. Sometimes I think about the size of the thing that hung on that. 100 lives more, and the hinge of it is a grandmother mentioning acorns to a child who wasn't even listening properly. I've written it down and stared at it. It doesn't reduce. I've tried. The card was a recipe. I got a look at it 2 months after the fire on account of she asked me to read it to her, and I couldn't figure out why until later. It was written in a slanted brown hand, in Chiricahua on one side and a rough English on the other, some missionary spelling, I'd guess, or maybe a schoolteacher's. Acorn stew, mesquite flour. The English side had gone faint in the fold and it said cook until it forgives you, which I took for a translation gone sideways. And Marta let me think so for a good long while before she told me no. That's what it said. That's exactly what it said. The card had been in a suitcase in a burning house, and she'd gone in after it while a coffee can with $11 sat 2 feet away. I put that in my ledger. M. Cazador owed an explanation. She never gave me one. Nobody would rent her anything. Let's have that on the table too. Ronan Pike owned the store, the feed lot, and the second mortgage on about a third of this valley including mine, and Pike went around saying, pleasantly, that was the thing about him, always pleasantly, always with his hand on your shoulder, that he had nothing against the woman personally but that a valley in hard times can't be taking on. Can't be taking on. He said it like it was a load in a wagon and she was more weight. So she squatted. That's the legal word for it. She squatted in an abandoned line shack up the Perdido bench that belonged to nobody living, and she cleared it, and she put a stovepipe through the roof, and she was gathering acorns within the week. I watched her do it from a distance, because I am a coward in a particular quiet way that took me most of my life to name. She'd go out at first light with a flour sack, emery oak, up the draws where there was still a little damp under the stone. She'd shake the branches with a pole and go on her knees for hours. Then she'd sit in the door of that shack cracking them one by one with a stone and leaching the meal in a cloth in a bucket. Changing the water and changing it, because acorn is bitter and it will not stop being bitter just because you're in a hurry. Days of that, for a bucket of meal. And here's the thing I could not make sense of in the beginning. She could have fed herself on a quarter of it. She was thin as a fence rail. She kept cooking more than one woman could eat. The first one she fed was Alma Freed's boy, Teddy, the one who'd stopped growing. He'd been sent up the bench to shoot rabbits, and he came back with nothing, which was usual by then, the rabbits being about hunted out, and he was standing in her yard because he smelled it. That's all. A 12-year-old with a rifle too big for him, standing in a stranger's yard, held there by a smell. I had it from Teddy himself, years after, and by then he was a grown man with a wife and a bad back, and he still couldn't get through the telling of it without stopping. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask whose he was. She came out with a bowl and she set it on the stump, didn't hand it to him, set it on the stump and walked back inside and left the door open and let him decide. He said the first mouthful didn't taste like anything he knew. He said it tasted the way the ground smells after rain, if the ground had milk in it. He said he ate it too fast and got sick behind the woodpile and was mortally ashamed, and when he came around the corner she had another bowl on the stump. He said she never once looked at me while I was eating, not once. I didn't understand that for 20 years. I understand it. It took me a while, but I understand it. There's a way of watching a hungry man eat that takes something from him. She wouldn't do it. She'd give you the food and give you your privacy at the same table, and I have never in my life seen anybody else manage that. By June, there were 9 of them coming up the bench. By August 30, she never announced anything. There was no sign. There was a woman on a bench above a dead river and a fire under an iron pot and a rule nobody ever spoke aloud, which was, you eat, and if you have something, you leave something, and if you don't, you don't, and nobody will look at you either way. Men left a rabbit. A boy left 3 eggs and lied about where he got them. Someone left a cracked china dog with no head, and Marta put it on the windowsill and it stayed there until the end, and I never once heard her make fun of it. Curtis Vance, the same Curtis Vance who owed me $2 from 1919, came up drunk one evening and told her she ought to charge, that she was a fool, that there wasn't a soul down there who'd do the same for her. She said, I know. That's all. I know. And she gave him a bowl and he ate it standing up, angry, glaring at the pot, and he came back the next week sober with a load of piñon wood he'd cut himself, and he didn't say one word about it, and neither did she. I've thought about that exchange more than most of the conversations of my life. There's not a soul down there who'd do the same for you. I know. It's not saintliness. Understand me. I'm not building a saint here, and she'd have hated it. It's something harder and more stubborn than saintliness. She knew exactly what the ledger said, and she went on feeding them anyway, not because she believed it would come back to her, but because, and this is my best guess after 30 years, and it's still a guess, because the alternative was to let her grandmother's card be nothing but paper. Now I have to tell about Pike. Ronan Pike was not a monster. I want to say that carefully, because it would be easier for me if he had been. He was a man who had loaned money to a valley that could not repay it, and he was frightened, and frightened men reach for order. What he saw from the store window was 30 men a week who used to owe him and take his credit and touch their hats, walking past his door and up the bench. What he said was that there was a question of sanitation. Then it was a question of title, the shack being on land he had a paper claim to, a paper he produced 8 months after she'd been living there, and which nobody had ever seen before. Then it was a question of what kind of valley we wanted to be. And in the fall of '35, on a night with no moon, somebody laid a line of kerosene along her porch boards. I am not going to tell you Pike did it, because I don't know, and I have made a policy in my old age of not entering things in the book that I can't source. I'll tell you what I do know. I know that Pike's hired man, a boy of 19 named Cole Yeager, was seen on the bench road that night. I know the sheriff, who was a decent man and a useless one, asked 3 questions and stopped. And I know that when the valley heard, when they heard she'd gone into the fire and come out with a card, there was a silence in this place that lasted about 4 days, and then something turned over, the way a herd turns, and nobody could have said who started it. 40 men rebuilt that shack in 9 days. They came with what they had, which was nothing, so they tore down their own outbuildings for the lumber. Freed brought the door off his own barn. Curtis Vance, still owing me $2, worked 6 days without being asked and slept in the wagon. I brought nails. I counted them out of the coffee tin, 360. I'd been saving them since 31, and I stood at the edge of that yard with my tin in my hands, and I could not for the life of me walk into the middle of it. I want to be honest about this, because it's the only reason I'm any use as a witness at all. I was afraid of her. I was 52 years old. I'd buried a wife and a son. I'd shot a man in France and thought about it every night since, and I was afraid of a 100-pound Apache woman with burned eyebrows. And it took me 20 more years to work out that what I was afraid of was being seen by somebody who didn't keep a ledger. She saw me anyway, came over, took the tin out of my hands, looked in it and said, 300. 360. And she laughed, first time. Short, surprised, cut off quick like she'd caught herself doing something in public. She said, of course you know. The valley started calling it the kitchen. Never her kitchen, just the kitchen, the way you'd say the church or the road. By the second winter she'd taught 6 women to leach acorn meal, which is a thing that takes patience and no skill, and which meant that when she took sick with pleurisy in January, the pot went on anyway, every day, for 11 days, and she lay in the back of the shack listening to it and did not once get up to correct anybody. She taught Alma Freed to grind mesquite pods into flour, and Alma's daughter, and the daughter taught the Vance girls. It went sideways through the valley the way a good thing does, without a plan, and by 36 there were 4 fires in 4 yards and Marta had nothing to do with 3 of them, and that seemed to be exactly what she wanted. I asked her once, this was late, this was near the end, why she never charged when she could have. She had 200 people fed by then. She could have had a house in town. She was cleaning the pot, she didn't look up. She said, at Sill they fed us, every day. Government beef and government flour, and it kept us alive, and every single day of my childhood I understood that I was alive because somebody had decided to allow it. Scraped, scraped. The iron sounded like a bell being rubbed. When you feed a person, she said, you can do it 2 ways. You can do it so they know they owe you, or you can do it so they know they're a person. She rinsed the pot. She set it upside down on the stones. It cost the same, she said. I have that in the ledger. Left hand side. It's the only thing in there that isn't a name or a number, and my daughter asked me about it once, and I told her it was a note about supplies, and I lied straight to her face, and I'd do it again, because it was mine. Here's where it goes hard, and I'm going to slow down, because I've rushed it before and it comes out wrong. The winter of 36 was the worst one. The drought had broke a little in the fall, enough rain to raise everybody's hopes, and not enough to raise a crop, which is the cruelest amount of rain there is. Then it turned cold, hard cold, a killing cold that came down out of the Sangers in the second week of December and stayed. The acorns were gone, that's the plain fact. 2 seasons of gathering and a bad mast year, and the oaks up the draws had given what they had. Marta had 1 sack of meal left, about 20 pounds, maybe 50 bowls. And she had 140 people coming. Nobody said it out loud. There was a week where the bowls got thinner and everybody pretended, and the men would say I ate at home, which was a lie, and take a half portion. And the children got the full, and the children knew, and got quiet the way children do, when they've been made complicit in something. I went up there on a Tuesday. I remember it was Tuesday because I'd been to town for kerosene, and Pike had smiled at me and asked, pleasantly, how the charity was faring up on the bench, and I'd said fine, and got in the truck, and sat there with my hands on the wheel for a long time. She was in the yard splitting wood. In that cold, her hands were cracked open across the knuckles, white splits in brown skin, and she'd wrapped them in rag and it had gone stiff. I said, "How much have you got left?" She said, "Enough." I said, "Marta," first time I'd used her name. She stood the axe up and put both hands on the head of it and looked at me, and there was a thing in her face I hadn't seen before and haven't got a word for. Not despair. Something more tired than despair. Despair has some heat in it. She said, 9 days. 9 days of food, 140 people, and a cold that was killing calves in the sheds. And then Cole Yeager came up the road. I knew him. Everybody knew him. Pike's hired man, 19 years old, seen on the bench road the night of the fire and never charged with a thing, and the valley had made its own verdict and delivered its own sentence, which was that no man spoke to him. 14 months of that. Nobody had said a word to Cole Yeager in 14 months except Pike, who paid him. He'd been let go in November. Pike couldn't carry a hired man anymore. He came up that road with his coat wrapped around him and his boots split open at the sole, and I watched him come and I felt my hand close on nothing. He stopped at the gate. He stood there. He was starving. I'd seen enough of it by then. The face goes a certain way around the eyes and the hands hang wrong, and he had that. Marta was looking at him and I was looking at Marta, and I don't believe she moved for the better part of a minute. 20 pounds of meal in that shack, 9 days. 140 people, and Teddy Freed among them, who'd stopped growing, and the Vance girls, and a woman down the bench who was carrying and due in March. And the boy who, probably, maybe, according to a verdict nobody had the courage to hand down, had put the match to her house. I will tell you what I thought standing there, and I have never told anybody, not my daughter, not the priest. I thought, don't. Not because I believed in the verdict, because it was 9 days, because it was arithmetic, because I am a man who keeps a ledger and the ledger was very clear, and any man in that valley would have told you the same, and there is not one of them who would have blamed her. She set the axe down. She went inside. I heard the lid of the pot. She came out with a bowl and she walked to the gate and she did not open it, and she set the bowl on the post, didn't hand it to him, set it on the post the way she'd set Teddy's on the stump, and she turned around and walked back to the woodpile and picked up her axe. She never looked at him while he ate. I did. God forgive me, I stood in that yard and watched a starving boy eat and I could not stop looking, and he ate with his back turned and his shoulders going, and I understood then, finally, at 53 years of age, exactly what it was she'd been giving people all along, and it wasn't the food. He set the bowl on the post upside down when he was done, clean. He said something to her. 2, 3 words. From where I stood I couldn't hear it, and I've spent 30 years not hearing it, and I've made up 9 different versions and thrown them all out. And Marta Cazador said, without turning around, loud enough for me, "Come back tomorrow." I got in my truck. I drove down the bench road and the cold came through the floorboards and I could not see, and I pulled over by the dry ford where the Rio Perdido used to run. I want to be very careful here, because this is the part I have lied about. I did not weep for the beauty of it. That's what I've let people think. That's the version I gave at the funeral, and it's a good version and it isn't true. I sat in that truck and I was furious, shaking with it, because a ledger is a way of being safe. A ledger says, this much and no more, this is what I owe and I will pay it, and then I will be clean, I will be even, nobody can ask another thing of me. 53 years I'd kept mine, every egg, every nail, every one of the 4 lies. And she'd just torn the whole book in half at a gate post with a bowl of acorn stew, and I saw, sitting at that dry ford, that if she was right then I had never in my life given anybody one single thing. I had only ever paid. 9 days of food. I want you to hold that, going into what comes next, because I don't think I can make it feel the way it felt. 9 days and 140 mouths, and a cold that wasn't breaking, and a woman with an axe and a card in a scorched suitcase who had just added one more name to the list. She was 38 years old. She had buried a daughter and a husband and a country. She owned a stove, a pot, a suitcase, and a piece of paper that told her to cook it until it forgives you. What she did over the next 11 weeks changed this valley for 2 generations, and it broke something in her that never mended. And I was there for all of it, and I have never been able to decide whether what I watched was a miracle or a bill coming due. The rain came in March. It came too late for the thing she'd been saving. I'm getting ahead. I said I'd tell it in order, and I'm not going to manage it, but I'll try. The morning after Cole Yeager ate at that gate, I drove up the bench with 360 nails in a coffee tin, which is a stupid thing to bring a starving woman, and I found her yard full of people, and I found out what she had decided to do. And I found out what she'd been keeping in the bottom of that suitcase all along, under the clothes, wrapped in a shirt that had belonged to somebody. That's what I came up to. I had my coffee tin of nails in my lap, and I parked crooked on the bench road, and I could hear nothing but the wind coming down off the sangers and 140 pounds of silence, and in the middle of it, Marta had the suitcase open on the ground. Cole Yeager was standing about 10 feet back from everybody else. Nobody had told him to. He just found the distance a man like him was allowed, and he stayed inside it. The suitcase was pasteboard black down one whole side where the fire had licked it, and it opened the way a bad hinge opens, half willing. There wasn't much in it. 2 dresses, a pair of scissors, a tintype so faded you couldn't tell which of the 3 people in it she was. And under all of it, a man's work shirt, folded, and inside the shirt a Prince Albert tobacco tin, and inside the tin corn. Not much corn. That's what I want to say first, because everybody who tells this story afterward makes it a bushel, and it wasn't. It was maybe 1.5 pounds of kernels. Blue-black mostly, with a red one here and there like a drop of something. Small ears, you could tell, nothing you'd plant for a crop. I did the arithmetic because that is my affliction. 1.5 pounds of corn feeds 140 people exactly nothing. It's 4 bowls. It's a joke. She held the tin in both hands, and she looked around that yard at all those faces, and she said, "My grandmother's grandmother carried this out of the Chiricahuas." Nobody moved. It was planted at Fort Sill every year I was a prisoner there, in the government's dirt with a government hoe. She turned the tin a little. Some of the kernels shifted and it made a sound like rain on a roof, a small dry sound, and I have heard it in my sleep. It was planted in Oklahoma every year until the dust. It has not missed a year in. She stopped, she was counting, she wasn't sure. And I heard myself say, out loud, in a voice I didn't recognize, how many. She looked at me, 58. 58 years, unbroken, through a prison camp and a diaspora and 2 states and a dust storm that killed her husband, and through a fire she had walked into on purpose. And I understood, standing there with 360 nails in a tin, that she had gone into that burning house for the recipe card, because a seed is nothing without the instruction, and the instruction is nothing without the seed. And she'd made a decision in a doorway with a roof coming down about which one she could carry with one hand. She got both. That's just luck. I've never made it mean more than that, and neither did she. Here's what she did with it, and it took me the rest of my life to accept. She counted out the kernels on the lid of the tin. 4 piles. She gave one to Alma Freed and one to Curtis Vance, and one to a Mescalero family down the bench named Sombrero, who'd been keeping to themselves so hard I'd forgotten they existed. And she kept one. Alma said, "Marta, I can't." And Marta said, "If it stays with me and I die, it dies." That's all. She closed the tin. She put the shirt back over the empty place where it had been. 40 people watched a woman give away the only thing she had left that could not be replaced, in the middle of a famine, to people who could not eat it and might well eat it anyway. I put it in the ledger that night. I wrote, M. Cazador, gave away the line. And then I sat looking at the right-hand column for I don't know how long, and I put down the pen, and I went out and stood in my own dead yard in the cold until I couldn't feel my hands. Now, 11 weeks. I have tried to write these 11 weeks a dozen times, and every time it comes out either a sermon or a lie, and I think it's because nothing happened in them. That's the truth of a famine. It isn't a story. It's a long gray subtraction. Yucca root, boiled 3 times to get the soap out of it. Prickly pear pads, singed on the stove and scraped. Mesquite pods ground with a stone, and the pods were 4 years old and full of weevil, and she ground the weevil in and said nothing about it, and neither did anybody else. Bones. We boiled bones that had been boiled twice before. There was 1 week in February where the pot was more or less hot water with sotol in it and a smell, and people came anyway and drank it and went home. The children came off first, is the thing. The children came off the meal before the adults did, and I have never got the taste of that out of my mouth. Teddy Freed sat on the stump one day in February and cried, and he was 13 and mortified, and Marta came out and sat next to him on the ground and did not say one word to him. Sat there in the cold, 20 minutes. Then she got up and went back to the fire. She did not tell him it would be all right. I want that noted. Everybody else in the valley was saying it would be all right, and she was the only one who wouldn't, and she was the only one any of us believed. Cole Yeager came back the next day like she said. And the day after, and after. He didn't eat first. He'd get there before light and he'd have the wood split before she came out, and he'd carry water up from the seep, 2 buckets, a half-mile each way, and he did it 11 weeks, and he never once got in the line until everybody else had gone. The valley didn't forgive him. Let's not pretend. They just stopped being able to look at him, which is a different thing, and in a small place it can pass for the same. I asked her about it. Once. In late January, when I'd got in the habit of driving up with whatever I could spare, which was less every week. I said, do you know what he did? She was skimming the pot. She said, he told me. I waited. God, I waited. I stood in that shack with my heart going, and I waited for a name for Pike, for the word that would let the valley do what the valley wanted to do. She skimmed the pot. I said, Marta. And she said, it's his to tell. She never told me. She never told anybody as far as I know, and Cole Yeager lived to be 71 years old in this valley, and he never told either. And there are men in the cemetery down there who went to their graves certain, and they were certain of different things. I'll say this much and no more. In 1961, at her funeral, Cole Yeager, a grandfather by then, deacon of the Baptist church, a man who'd given 40 years of Saturdays to other people's roofs, stood at the back and would not come forward. Wouldn't come forward. His daughter had hold of his arm and he shook his head at her. You can make of that what you like. I've made 100 things of it, and none of them let me sleep better. Ronan Pike's move came in the 2nd week of February, and it was the smartest thing he ever did, and it very nearly finished us. He didn't send the sheriff. He'd learned. What he did was file a proper claim on that bench, legitimate or legitimate enough, some tangle of a tax sale from 1928, and then he came up the road himself in a good coat with his hat in his hand. And he offered her a house in town. That was it. That was the whole thing. A little frame house behind the store, rent-free, hers as long as she wanted it. And he said this part with his hand almost on her shoulder, almost. He had the sense not to, and the town would see that she was taken care of. She'd have had a stove that drew, a floor, a roof that didn't drop snow on the bed. And the kitchen would have been in town, on Pike's ground, behind Pike's store, and every man who ate there would have walked past his window to do it and touched his hat and been taken care of. He was smiling. That was his gift, that pleasant, and it was not entirely false. I think some part of him meant it. I think a man can offer you a kindness and a leash in the same hand and not be able to tell them apart himself. She said no. He said, "Think about it." She said no. And Pike stood in that yard a minute with his hat and looked at the pot, and looked at the 40-odd people who had rebuilt the shack he'd claimed, and something went over his face. I saw it. I was 15 feet away, something that I would swear on my life was grief, and then it was gone and he put his hat on and went down the road. He was foreclosed himself by August. The bank in Santa Fe took the store. He lasted here another year. I said I'd tell about the rain. It came on the 9th of March, 1937, at about 4 in the afternoon, and it came the way it does here, all at once, a wall of it walking up the valley from the south, and every single person in Rio Perdido went outside and stood in it. I stood in my yard with my hat off, and my mouth open like a fool, and the water going down inside my collar, and I laughed, until I had to sit down on the step. And I was not the only one. And the Ford filled, and the Perdido came up out of the ground where it had been hiding for 5 years and ran brown and loud all night. I drove up the bench in the morning to see her face. There were people already there. Curtis Vance had his tin. Alma had hers and the sombreros theirs, and they were standing around in the mud with those Prince Albert tins in their hands like men at a christening who don't know where to put themselves. And Marta was in the doorway. She couldn't stand up. Her lungs had gone. Pleurisy in 35, and 11 weeks of yucca and cold water and splitting wood in a February that killed grown cattle, and she'd been coughing since Christmas and telling everybody it was the smoke off green piñon, and it was not the smoke off green piñon. She was 39 years old and she weighed about 90 pounds, and she could not get out of that doorway to plant the corn her grandmother's grandmother carried out of the mountains. She never once asked anybody for anything. Understand me. She had fed this valley for 3 years and she did not know how to ask. It wasn't in her. They'd raised it out of her at Fort Sill, or she'd cut it out of herself somewhere. And she sat in that doorway looking at the wet field, and she did not say a word. Curtis Vance took the door off its hinges. Just took it off. 2 pins, a knife handle, and the door came off in his hands. And he and Freed and Cole Yeager and a man named Ortiz laid it down and got her onto it. And she cursed at them. And she was too weak to fight, and they carried her out into that field on her own front door and set her down in the mud. And she planted, sitting down. 3 hours. Kneeling, then sitting, then lying on her side by the end of it, pushing kernels into the wet ground with 2 fingers, and nobody helped her with that part because she wouldn't have it. And 40 people stood at the edge of that field and watched a dying woman plant corn 1 seed at a time, and not one of us made a sound. I counted, I don't know why, 211 kernels. She had the tintype in her coat, and the shoe. I hadn't known about the shoe until that morning. It was a child's, about a 3, brown, worn through at the toe the way they get when a kid drags 1 foot. It had been in the shirt with the tin all that time, and I never saw it until she took it out in the field and put it in the ground with the last of the corn and covered it with her hand. I asked her later when she could talk, months later, sitting up in a chair somebody had hauled up the bench. I asked her why she'd buried it, and it was a stupid question, and I knew it while it was coming out. She said, because I kept it. And I said, not understanding, what? And she said, I kept it and I couldn't keep her. That's all. She didn't cry. She was looking out at the corn, which was up by then about knee-high, the blue-black kind with the red kernel here and there, the first crop in 59 years, and every one of those years accounted for. She said, I don't want to be a woman who keeps things. She lived 24 more years. I want to say that plainly, because I have heard this story told at church suppers with her dying in that field, and it makes people cry, and it is a lie, and the truth is harder and better, and nobody wants it. She lived. She never got her lungs back. She never walked the oak draws again, never gathered another acorn in her life, not one. And every winter for 24 years she was in a chair by a stove coughing, and other people brought her wood, and she hated it, and she let them. That's the sacrifice, not the field, the letting. The kitchen went on. It went on without her, which is what she'd built it to do, and by 1943 there were 11 yards in this valley with a pot in them, and there was a woman in Tres Piedras teaching it who had never met Marta Cazador and never knew her name. That's how it went. Sideways, unattributed, the way water goes. The corn went sideways too. Alma's tin came up. The sombreros came up. Curtis Vance, who owed me $2 from 1919, planted his in a fence corner and lost half to crows and got the rest, and his granddaughter has it now, in a jar, in a house in Albuquerque with a garage, and she showed it to me last spring and I sat in her kitchen and had to be excused. Marta's own 211 did not all come up. About a third of them. That's normal. That's how it is. I've thought about that a great deal. She gave away 3/4 of the line and kept a quarter and lost 2/3 of the quarter, and it's still here. It's in a jar in Albuquerque. And if she'd kept the whole tin in her suitcase and guarded it and been sensible, it would have burned in the second fire in '48 along with the shack and the stove and everything else. There's no lesson in that I can put on the left-hand side of a page. I've tried. It's just how it fell out. I want to tell one more thing, and then I'm going to stop. In the spring of 1957, I drove up the bench to bring her some pears. She was 59. I was 74. We had, by then, an arrangement where I came on Thursdays and we said almost nothing to one another for 2 hours, and it was the best part of my week, and I never told her so. She was in her chair. The stove was going. She was cold in May. And I said, out of nowhere, no lead-up, an old man's mouth running ahead of him, I said, "Marta, I kept a ledger my whole life." She said, "I know it." I said, "I've got a page in there with your name on it, just the name, 50, 60 times, and nothing in the other column." She didn't laugh. She looked at the stove. She said, "What did you want to put?" And I said, and my voice did a thing, and I let it, I said, "I wanted to put what I owe you, and I couldn't get a number." Marta Cazador sat there. She had her hands in her lap, cracked open across the knuckles the way they'd been since 36 and never healed right. 90-some pounds of woman in a chair, and a valley outside the window that would not have existed without her, and a card in a tin on the shelf that said "Cook until it forgives you," which is either a bad translation or the truest sentence anyone in this valley ever wrote down. She said, "That's because there isn't one." And then she said the thing I have carried for 30 years and never once been able to set down. She said, "You keep a book because you want to be even. Nobody's even. There's no such thing." She coughed and waited it out and went on. "I fed you because you were there. That's all it ever was. There's nothing owed." I said, "There's everything owed." And she said, "Then feed somebody." I went home that night and I got the ledger out. 63 years of it. Eggs and fence wire and Curtis Vance's $2 and the 4 lies I told my wife. I didn't burn it. I'm not that kind of man and I never was, and anyway it was the only thing my father left me. But I took out the page with her name on it, and I turned it over, and on the back, where there's no columns, where it's just blank, I started writing this. It's taken me most of a year. I don't know if I've got it right. I have told you what I saw, and I have told you where I was standing when I saw it, which is the most any witness can do, and where I've guessed I've said so. There was a girl at the funeral I didn't know. 22, maybe. She'd come up from Deming with a pot in the back of her car, and she stood at the grave a long time after everybody else had gone, and when I asked her, she said her mother had eaten at a fire in Tres Piedras in 1944 and had told her about it every year of her life, and she'd never known where it started. I told her. She said, "What was she like?" And I opened my mouth to tell her, and what came out instead was, she had 1 suitcase. That's the ending I've got. I've written 6 others and thrown them out. She had 1 suitcase and a card, and she went into a burning house and came out with both, and the arithmetic of it does not work. It has never once worked, and I have stopped.